In Washington, D.C., a battle is brewing over the public's right to know what its military is doing. The Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense, has issued a new set of rules for journalists. Press freedom groups are calling it an unprecedented message of intimidation. This new policy is forcing a showdown between the government and the news organizations that cover it, with reporters facing a stark choice: sign on to the new rules or risk losing access to the building. This controversy didn't come out of nowhere. It's the latest development in a tense relationship between the press and the Pentagon under Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. A former media personality himself, Hegseth has previously accused journalists of hunting for scandals and being part of the fake news. The new rules were introduced following his stated frustration over media leaks. It all started in late September 2025, when the Pentagon released a 17-page draft of new restrictions. That initial version was severe. It required journalists to get approval from a Pentagon official before publishing any information that wasn't officially released by the department. This applied even if the information was not classified. The reaction from news organizations was swift and unified: condemnation. At the time, Secretary Hegseth posted on social media, stating, "The press does not run the Pentagon, the people do, and that reporters must wear a badge and follow the rules or go home." After weeks of tense negotiations with groups like the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, the Pentagon released a revised policy. The new version walked back the most explosive requirement. It no longer explicitly demands prior approval before publication, but for press freedom advocates, the danger has not passed. Here's the core of the issue. To get or keep their press credentials, journalists are now required to sign a document. In it, they must affirm their understanding of the new rules, even if they don't agree with them. Reporters have been given a deadline of next week to sign. The policy still warns that credentials can be revoked for the unauthorized disclosure of classified information, or something called controlled unclassified information. So what is controlled unclassified information, or CUI? Think of it as a category of sensitive government data.
While not officially classified as secret or top secret, it's information that the government believes needs to be protected and not shared publicly. This can include anything from early planning documents for military operations to technical data about weapons systems. The Pentagon Press Association, or PPA, which represents journalists from outlets across the political spectrum, says the policy is still designed to stifle a free press. They argue it sends a message of intimidation to everyone within the DoD, effectively warning them not to have unapproved conversations with reporters. The PPA says the policy wrongly suggests that a service member speaking to a reporter without permission is committing a criminal act. This creates what journalists call a chilling effect. Reporting on any large, powerful institution, especially the military, relies on speaking with sources inside the organization. These people, often granted anonymity to protect them from retaliation, can provide context, flag problems, or expose wrongdoing that would otherwise remain hidden from the public. They risk their careers, and sometimes their safety, to bring important information to light. Press groups fear this new policy will frighten those sources into silence, making it impossible to report stories that matter. The PPA warns that the policy could be used to punish reporters for simply doing their jobs, exercising their First Amendment rights to seek out information that hasn't been pre-approved for release. They even fear it could potentially expose us to prosecution. The Pentagon maintains that it has negotiated in good faith. A department spokesperson said that Congress has made it clear that the unauthorized release of sensitive information by service members is a crime, and that the Pentagon's policy prohibits journalists from soliciting them to commit crimes. But news organizations aren't convinced. The National Press Club president, Mike Balsamo, put it this way: "If the news about our military must first be approved by the government, then the public is no longer getting independent reporting. It is getting only what officials want them to see." This isn't the first time the government and the press have clashed over secrecy. The situation brings to mind the famous Pentagon Papers case in 1971.
Back then, the government tried to stop the New York Times and the Washington Post from publishing a top-secret history of the Vietnam War that had been leaked by an analyst. That study revealed that multiple administrations had systematically lied to the public and Congress about the war. The Supreme Court ultimately sided with the newspapers in a landmark ruling for freedom of the press. The current conflict over press access is part of a wider pattern. The Pentagon also plans to move news organizations from their current workspaces, a move the PPA says will further isolate reporters. Earlier in the year, some major news outlets were removed from their offices and replaced with more conservative-leaning publications. This is all happening in the context of a Trump administration that has also sought to rename the Defense Department the Department of War. As the deadline to sign approaches, a showdown looms. Several major news organizations, including the New York Times and The Atlantic, have stated they have problems with the revised policy and will not sign it as it stands. Many newsrooms are vowing to push back and are reportedly exploring their legal options. What's at stake is the fundamental tension between a government's desire to control information and the public's right to be informed by an independent press. The outcome of this conflict will determine how much the American people are allowed to know about the most powerful military in the world.
In the world of politics, winning is usually the end of the story. But what happens when a candidate wins his election and then sues anyway? That's the unusual question at the heart of a case now before the Supreme Court, a case that could change how and when election laws are challenged in the United States. The story begins with Republican Congressman Mike Bost of Illinois. In 2022, Bost won his re-election campaign comfortably in a district that strongly favors his party. Despite the victory, he filed a lawsuit against Illinois election officials. His target was a state law that allows mail-in ballots to be counted if they arrive up to 14 days after Election Day, as long as they are postmarked on or before that day. Bost argues this practice violates federal law, which sets a single, uniform day for federal elections. He claims that counting what he calls late-arriving ballots dilutes the value of votes cast on time. This isn't just an issue in Illinois. At least 16 other states have similar laws, making this case a focal point in the national debate over mail-in voting. However, the Supreme Court isn't actually deciding whether the Illinois law is right or wrong. Instead, the entire case hinges on a fundamental legal principle called standing. So what is legal standing? In simple terms, to sue someone in federal court, you have to prove that you have suffered a specific and personal harm or injury. You can't sue just because you disagree with a law as a matter of principle. Think of it this way. If your neighbor has an overgrown tree on their property, but it's on the far side of their yard and doesn't hang over your fence or block your view, a court would likely say you have no standing to sue them to cut it down. You haven't been directly harmed. Applying this to Representative Bost, two lower federal courts looked at his case and threw it out. Their reasoning was straightforward. Since Bost won his election easily, he couldn't show any real injury. Therefore, he had no standing to sue. But Bost's lawyers argue that candidates are in a unique position. They claim the injury isn't just about winning or losing. They point to two specific harms. First, a pocketbook injury, because the campaign had to pay staff and spend resources to monitor the ballot counting process for an extra 2 weeks. Second, they argue a candidate can suffer reputational harm if their margin of victory is smaller than it might have been. This brings us to the oral arguments held at the Supreme Court on October 8, 2025.
In a surprising turn, a majority of the justices from both the conservative and liberal wings seemed open to the idea of letting Bost's lawsuit move forward. Their concern wasn't necessarily about Bost's specific complaints, but about the bigger picture. Chief Justice John Roberts voiced a major concern, calling the alternative a potential disaster. He worried that if only candidates in very close races are allowed to sue, courts would be forced to jump into election disputes at the most fraught time, right after an election when tensions are highest. Other justices, including Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, expressed discomfort with a system that would require lower court judges to act like political fortune tellers, trying to predict how close an election will be just to decide who gets to file a lawsuit. Not all justices were convinced. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson questioned whether a smaller than hoped-for margin of victory is a true legal injury, suggesting it might be a disappointment but not a basis for a lawsuit. And Justice Elena Kagan, while questioning the need for the suit, also signaled a search for a middle ground, a way to allow this case to proceed without opening the floodgates to endless litigation. So why does this procedural case matter so much? The court's decision could have major ripple effects. A ruling in favor of Bost would likely make it much easier for candidates for federal office to challenge state election laws they dislike, even if they expect to win. This could shift the entire timeline of election litigation, moving it from a chaotic scramble after Election Day to a series of challenges filed long before anyone casts a vote. The case is deeply connected to the broader, ongoing political debates about election integrity and the reliability of mail-in voting. The central question the justices must answer is not about the rules of mail-in voting itself, but about who gets to challenge those rules and when. The final decision is expected by the end of June 2026, and it will set a new precedent for the role of the courts in American elections.
Welcome to AI TV News. Millions along the United States East Coast are bracing for a powerful coastal storm, a nor'easter, forecast to spin up this weekend. From the Carolinas to southern New England, residents should prepare for heavy rain, strong winds, and potentially dangerous coastal flooding. First, a quick explainer. A nor'easter is driven by persistent northeast winds along the shoreline. It forms when cold, dry Canadian air collides with warm, moist air over the Atlantic. That clash fuels the storm's intensity. Unlike hurricanes, which feed on warm ocean air alone, nor'easters draw energy from the temperature contrast between the two air masses. Because it's October and temperatures remain relatively mild, this storm is expected to deliver rain rather than snow. Here's the current timeline. A stalled cold front off the southeast coast is expected to organize near Georgia and the Carolinas. As the system consolidates, downpours will spread into coastal North Carolina. NOAA has already assigned that area a level 2 of 4 flash flood risk. The storm should strengthen and expand northward. Flash flood concerns extend from North Carolina to Long Island, covering major population centers such as Philadelphia and New York City. The worst conditions may linger into early next week, possibly through Tuesday, keeping the mid-Atlantic and southern New England under hazardous weather for several days. Rainfall totals through Monday are projected at 2 to 3 inches for most locations, with isolated pockets reaching 3 to 5 inches. Urban areas and spots with poor drainage will be particularly prone to sudden flooding. Winds will pose their own threat. Gusts of 30 to 50 miles per hour are likely along the northeast coast Sunday into Monday. Exposed headlands and barrier islands could see gusts topping 60 miles per hour, enough to down trees and trigger power outages. Coastal flooding is another serious concern. Persistent onshore winds will shove seawater toward the shore, preventing normal ebb during high tides. Moderate to major flooding is possible, and forecasters warn of pounding surf between 6 and 13 feet that could chew away beaches. That risk is especially worrisome for vulnerable stretches such as North Carolina's Outer Banks, where several homes have already been claimed by the ocean this year. Experts warn this storm could inflict coastline-altering damage.
Communities from Charleston, South Carolina, to Ocean City, Maryland, and up the Delaware coast are all on alert. There is still some uncertainty about the storm's exact track and speed. One scenario pushes it quickly up the coastline, delivering a direct hit to cities from Baltimore to Boston Sunday and Monday. Another keeps the system crawling, focusing its harshest impacts on the Carolinas, Maryland, and Delaware before gradually sliding north. Forecasters are monitoring how far inland or offshore the core of the storm will travel. The Weather Prediction Center has already cautioned that this could become a full-fledged and rather significant nor'easter. If you live anywhere from the southeast beaches to southern New England, stay tuned to local updates, secure loose outdoor items, prepare for possible outages, and never drive through flooded roads. We'll continue to track the storm and bring you updates. For now, make a plan, stay informed, and stay safe.